Right now, somewhere between 55,000 and 80,000 people are sitting in solitary confinement in American prisons, locked in cells roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, 23 hours a day. No human contact, no natural light, nothing but walls and silence. The United Nations calls anything over 15 days torture. And it all started here, Philadelphia, 1829, with a building designed by Quakers who genuinely believed they were saving souls. Eastern State Penitentiary was supposed to end cruelty. No more public hangings. No more whippings in the town square. No more branding criminals like cattle. Instead, prisoners would sit alone in vaulted cells with skylights the guards called the Eye of God, reflecting on their sins until they found redemption. It was the most expensive building America had ever constructed. $800,000 in 1829, roughly $22 million today. It had luxuries that the President of the United States did not have. Flush toilets, central heating, running water in every cell. And within 10 years, prisoners were going insane. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and called what he witnessed worse than any physical torture. The prison's own doctors documented hallucinations, delusions, and complete mental collapse. At least one prisoner died after an iron gag was clamped to his tongue for speaking to another inmate. He bled out in his cell within an hour. But here is what makes this story urgent. Despite nearly 200 years of documented failure, despite Charles Dickens writing that it destroyed men's minds, despite the United Nations calling it torture, America built more than 30 supermax prisons using essentially the same model, the same cell dimensions, the same isolation, the same psychological destruction. Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971. Today it sits in Philadelphia as a crumbling ruin, preserved in its decay as a monument to good intentions gone catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how America's most influential prison design was born, how it broke thousands of minds, and why we are still repeating the same mistakes nearly 2 centuries later. To understand why Eastern State Penitentiary was built, you have to understand what it was supposed to replace. And what it was supposed to replace was genuinely horrific. In colonial America and the early Republic, there was no such thing as prison as punishment. Prisons existed, but only as holding cells. You sat in a jail while you waited for your actual punishment. And that punishment was public. It was brutal, and it was designed to humiliate. Thieves got their ears cropped off. Counterfeiters had their foreheads branded with a hot iron. Repeat offenders were whipped at the public post, sometimes dozens of lashes, while the whole town watched. For serious crimes, you were hanged in the town square, and they'd leave your body swinging for days as a warning to everyone else. This was justice in the 18th century in America. Fast, cheap, and visible. The philosophy was simple. Make punishment so terrifying that nobody would dare commit a crime. And if they did commit one anyway, make an example of them so gruesome that others would think twice. But here is the problem. It wasn't working. Crime rates weren't dropping. Public executions were turning into carnival spectacles where pickpockets worked the crowd while a man swung from the gallows. The whole system felt medieval, barbaric, unworthy of a nation that had just declared all men created equal. And in Philadelphia, a group of wealthy reformers decided something had to change. On May 8, 1787, 37 prominent citizens gathered at the home of Benjamin Franklin. Among them was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the most respected physicians in America. They founded an organization with a name that tells you everything about their intentions: the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. These were not radicals. They were the establishment: doctors, lawyers, merchants, clergy. Many were Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends, who believed every human being carried a divine inner light that could be reached through silence and reflection. And they looked at the criminal justice system and saw not just cruelty, but waste. Whipping a man did not make him less likely to steal. It just made him angrier, more desperate, more damaged. Hanging him eliminated the problem, yes, but it also eliminated any chance of redemption. What if there was another way? Dr. Rush became the intellectual architect of a radical idea. What if punishment could transform instead of destroy? What if you could take a criminal and, through careful treatment, turn him into a productive citizen? Rush called his vision a house of repentance, a place where criminals would be isolated from the corrupting influence of other criminals, given time alone to reflect on their sins, and guided back to God through silence and contemplation. He even coined a new word for this kind of institution: penitentiary, from the Latin poenitentia, a place of penitence. In 1787, Rush wrote out his vision in detail. Let the avenue to this house be rendered difficult and gloomy by mountains and morasses. Let the doors be of iron, and let the grating occasioned by opening and shutting them extend a sound that shall deeply pierce the soul. He wanted prisoners to feel the weight of their crimes from the moment they approached the building. But once inside, they would not be tortured. They would be reformed through solitude, labor, and the Word of God. The reformers got their first chance to experiment in 1790 when Pennsylvania converted a wing of the Walnut Street Jail into something new: solitary cells where the worst offenders would be kept apart from everyone else. No whipping, no branding, just isolation and hard labor. It was America's first attempt at the penitentiary concept. And almost immediately, it started falling apart. The Walnut Street Jail was overcrowded from the start. Cells designed for one person held 3 or 4. The solitary prisoners could hear each other through the walls. They passed notes. They talked. The whole point of separation was undermined by architecture that could not support it. Worse, the conditions were appalling. Men, women, and children crammed together in the general population. Disease spread through filthy corridors. Prisoners fought, gambled, drank smuggled alcohol. Guards took bribes. The jail became a school for crime, where petty thieves learned from hardened criminals and came out worse than they went in. By the 18-teens, the Walnut Street experiment was considered a failure, but the reformers did not abandon their idea. They doubled down on it. The problem, they decided, was not the philosophy. It was the execution. Walnut Street had tried to do reform on the cheap, retrofitting an old jail instead of building something purpose-designed. If you really wanted to transform criminals through isolation, you needed a building engineered from the ground up for total separation. You needed walls thick enough that no sound could pass through. Cells large enough that a man could live his entire sentence without ever leaving. A design so complete, so total, that prisoners would have no choice but to confront their own souls. You needed the most expensive, most advanced, most ambitious prison ever constructed. Dr. Benjamin Rush died in 1813, never seeing his vision fully realized, but the society he helped found kept pushing. In 1821, the Pennsylvania legislature finally approved funding for a new state penitentiary to be built on a cherry orchard just outside Philadelphia. They called it Cherry Hill. The world would come to know it as Eastern State Penitentiary. The man they chose to design it was about to create something that would influence prison architecture for the next 200 years. In 1821, the Pennsylvania legislature announced a competition to design the new state penitentiary. The winner would receive a $100 prize. For architects in early America, this was more than money. It was a chance to define what a prison should look like for generations. The winner was a 30-year-old British-trained architect named John Haviland. His design was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Haviland had studied in London under James Elms, learning the principles of institutional architecture. He had immigrated to Philadelphia in 1816, built a reputation designing churches and public buildings, and now he was about to attempt something no architect had ever done. He would build a structure specifically engineered to break human contact while preserving human life. The philosophy he worked from was called the Pennsylvania System, also known as the Separate System. Its core principle was total isolation. Every prisoner in his own cell. No communication with other inmates, no shared meals, no congregate labor, no human contact whatsoever except for the warden, the guards, and the occasional minister. Reformers believed criminal behavior spread like disease. Put a petty thief in a room with a murderer, and the thief learns from the murderer. Contamination, they said. The only way to prevent it was complete separation, and the only way to achieve complete separation was architecture. Haviland's solution was the hub and spoke design. Picture a wagon wheel. At the center sits an octagonal rotunda, the surveillance hub. Radiating outward from that hub, like spokes, are 7 long cell blocks. A single guard standing in the central rotunda can see down all 7 corridors simply by turning around. It is elegant, it is efficient, and it is terrifying. The design drew inspiration from Jeremy Bentham's panopticon concept, the idea that prisoners who believe they are always being watched will regulate their own behavior. But Haviland took it further. Bentham imagined prisoners visible to each other in a circular arrangement. Haviland wanted them invisible. Each prisoner isolated not just from guards, but from every other human being in the building. The cells themselves were engineering marvels. 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, ceilings that soared 10 to 16 feet high, with vaulted stone arches that made each cell feel like a small cathedral. The walls were 18 inches thick, solid stone, designed to make communication between cells impossible. You could scream, and the prisoner next door would not hear you. Each cell had a single source of natural light. A circular skylight in the vaulted ceiling was positioned so that a beam of sunlight would fall into the cell like a spotlight from heaven. The guards called it the Eye of God. The message was clear. Even in total isolation, you are being watched, not by guards, but by the Almighty Himself. And here is what made Eastern State truly revolutionary. Every cell was self-contained. Running water piped in through individual lines. A flush toilet, one of the first in America, connected to the sewer through separate pipes so prisoners could not tap out messages through the plumbing. Central heating, a luxury that most Americans, including the president, did not have in their homes. Attached to the back of each cell was a private exercise yard, the same dimensions as the cell, 8 by 12 feet, surrounded by walls 10 feet high, open to the sky. For 1 hour each day, a prisoner could step through a small door in the back of his cell and stand outside, alone, unable to see any other prisoner, unable to be seen. A man could serve his entire sentence, years, sometimes decades, without ever laying eyes on another inmate. The exterior of the building was designed to intimidate. Haviland chose a Gothic revival style, all battlements and towers and medieval menace. The front facade featured massive stone walls 30 feet high, extending 10 feet underground to prevent tunneling. A giant iron-studded oaken gate with a wrought iron portcullis. Corner towers that looked like something from a feudal castle. Haviland was explicit about his intentions. He said the building should convey to the mind a cheerless blank indicative of the misery which awaits the unhappy being who enters within its walls. He wanted criminals to feel dread from the moment they saw it. He wanted the architecture itself to be part of the punishment. But step inside, past that terrifying entrance, and the building transforms. The cell block corridors, are 30 feet high with barrel-vaulted ceilings and tall arched windows. Light floods in. The proportions feel almost ecclesiastical. Haviland called his creation a forced monastery, a machine for spiritual transformation. Construction began in 1822 on 11 acres of farmland at Cherry Hill, about a mile outside Philadelphia's city limits. The original budget was $250,000. By the time the first cell block was completed 7 years later, in 1829, they had already spent twice that. When the entire complex was finished in 1836, the total cost had ballooned to $800,000. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $22 million today. It was the most expensive public building ever constructed in America, more than the United States Capitol, more than any government building, any church, any structure of any kind. The reformers did not flinch. This was an investment in human transformation. This was the future of criminal justice. This was going to prove that punishment could be humane, that criminals could be saved, that America had found a better way. And the world was watching. Delegations arrived from England, France, Prussia, Russia. They toured the unfinished cell blocks, marveled at the engineering, took notes, asked questions. Many of them went home and built their own versions. Pentonville Prison in London, La Petite Roquette in Paris, dozens more across Europe, South America, Asia. By some estimates, more than 300 prisons worldwide were modeled on Eastern States design, the hub and spoke layout, the individual cells, the philosophy of total isolation. John Haviland had created the most architecturally influential prison in human history. But architecture can only do so much. A building can separate bodies, it can block sound, it can control light, space, and movement. What it cannot do is predict what happens to a human mind when you lock it in a stone box for years at a time. On October 25, 1829, the gates of Eastern State Penitentiary opened for the first time. The experiment was about to begin. And the first subject, the first human being to experience what the reformers had built, was an 18-year-old black farmer from Harrisburg who had stolen a $20 watch. His name was Charles Williams. He was about to become prisoner number 1. Charles Williams was 18 years old when he walked through the gates of Eastern State Penitentiary, a black farmer from Harrisburg, convicted of burglary. He had stolen a watch worth $20, a gold seal worth $3, and a gold key. His sentence was 2 years. 2 years does not sound like much, but Charles Williams was not going to a normal prison. He was about to experience something no human being had ever experienced before: total isolation, enforced by the most sophisticated architecture in America. The moment Williams entered the prison, a black hood was pulled over his head. He could not see where he was going. He could not see the guards leading him. He could not see the corridors, the other cells, or any hint of another human presence. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was policy. The hood was called an emblem. The curtain dropped between the prisoner and the living world. Every inmate wore one whenever they left their cell, for admission, for medical treatment, for transfer, for release. The earliest versions had no eye holes at all. You walked blind, guided by hands you could not see, into a building you would never fully comprehend. Charles Williams was led to his cell. The hood came off. The door closed behind him. And for the next 2 years, this 8 by 12-foot stone room would be his entire universe. The daily routine was crushing in its monotony. Wake at dawn. The only light comes from that single skylight in the vaulted ceiling, the eye of God, shifting slowly across the floor as the sun moves overhead. No clock. No way to mark time except the movement of that pale beam. Breakfast arrives through a small rectangular feeding door cut into the cell wall. A metal slot, about 8 inches tall, just wide enough to slide a tray through. You never see the hand that delivers it. You hear footsteps approach, the slot opens, food appears, the slot closes. That is your human contact for the morning. Then work. Every prisoner was assigned solitary labor, shoemaking, weaving, picking oakum, which meant unraveling old ropes into loose fibers that could be sold to shipyards for caulking. The work served two purposes. It kept prisoners occupied, preventing the madness that comes from pure idleness, and it taught them a trade they could use after release. You worked alone in your cell from 6 in the morning until 7 at night. 13 hours. No conversation, no music, no sound except your own breathing and the occasional distant clang of an iron door. Lunch through the feeding slot. More work. Dinner through the feeding slot. Then 1 hour of exercise. You would hear a key turn in the small door at the back of your cell. Step through into your private yard, 8 by 12 feet, surrounded by 10-foot walls, open to the sky. You could see clouds. You could feel rain. But you could not see another living soul. The walls were angled so that even if you climbed, you would only see more walls. After exercise, back to your cell. The door locks, the light fades. You sleep. And then you do it again, and again, and again, for months, for years, for however long your sentence runs. The guards wore felt coverings over their shoes, soft wool that muffled their footsteps on the stone floors. Prisoners could never tell when they were being watched. A guard might be standing right outside your door, peering through the small observation hole, and you would have no idea. The silence was total. The only permitted speech came on Sundays. Ministers would walk the corridors preaching sermons, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Prisoners could not respond, could not ask questions, could not confess or seek counsel. They could only listen through their iron doors as scripture washed over them. The only permitted reading was the Bible. No newspapers, no letters from family, no books of any kind, except the Word of God. The reformers believed that scripture, combined with silence and solitude, would penetrate even the most hardened criminal heart. Visitors were forbidden for most prisoners. No family, no friends, no lawyers except in rare circumstances. The warden was legally required to visit every inmate daily, but these visits happened through the feeding slot or the observation hole. Brief check-ins, a few words at most, then gone. Think about what this means. A man could enter Eastern State Penitentiary at 25 years old, serve a 10-year sentence, and never once have a face-to-face conversation with another human being. Never share a meal, never shake a hand, never see a smile or a frown or any expression at all. Just walls and silence and the slow crawl of light across a stone floor. The reformers watching this system believed it was working. They visited the cells and found prisoners who seemed calm, docile, focused on their labor. They interpreted this as evidence of inner transformation. The criminals were finding God. They were reflecting on their sins. They were being reformed. What they did not see or chose not to see were the cracks forming beneath the surface. Within the first few years, guards began reporting strange behaviors, prisoners talking to themselves, prisoners talking to insects, to spiders, to the mice that occasionally slipped through cracks in the stone. Prisoners staring at walls for hours, unresponsive to any stimulus. Some prisoners stopped eating. Others refused to work. A few began screaming for no apparent reason, shrieking that echoed through the cell blocks, and then stopped as suddenly as it started. By 1838, less than a decade after Eastern State opened, the Prison Discipline Society's annual reports included a new category: effects of the system of solitary confinement, day and night, on the mind. The documented symptoms included hallucinations, delusions, inability to hold a pen, inability to recognize direction, and what one physician called complete derangement of the nervous system. One prisoner, whose name has been lost to history, left a written account of his experience. In the gloomy solitude of a sullen cell, there is not one redeeming principle. There is but one step between the prisoner and insanity. The reformers had built the most advanced prison in human history. They had engineered total isolation with a precision no one had achieved before. And they were discovering slowly, reluctantly, that the human mind cannot survive what they had created. But they didn't stop. They didn't modify the system. They didn't question whether their philosophy might be flawed. Instead, they blamed the prisoners. They blamed weakness of character. They blamed predisposition to madness. They blamed everything except the silent stone cells they had so carefully designed. And then, in 1842, the most famous writer in the world came to see it for himself. His name was Charles Dickens. What he witnessed would produce one of the most devastating critiques of any institution ever written. In January 1842, Charles Dickens boarded a steamship in Liverpool bound for America. He was 29 years old and already the most famous writer in the English-speaking world. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop. Millions of readers on both sides of the Atlantic devoured everything he wrote. America was desperate to see him. Lecture halls sold out months in advance. Newspapers tracked his movements like he was royalty. Everyone wanted a piece of Charles Dickens. But Dickens had his own agenda. Before he left England, he made a short list of things he actually wanted to see in America. Niagara Falls was one. The other was a prison in Philadelphia that everyone was calling the future of criminal justice, Eastern State Penitentiary. He had heard the claims, a humane alternative to torture and execution, a place where criminals found redemption through solitary reflection, the most advanced prison design in human history. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. On March 8, 1842, Dickens walked through those Gothic gates. The warden gave him a full tour. They walked the long vaulted corridors. They peered into cells. And Dickens, unlike the reformers and the legislators and the international delegations, actually talked to the prisoners. What he found horrified him. Dickens published his account 7 months later in a book called American Notes for General Circulation. His verdict was unequivocal. The system here is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement. I believe it in its effects to be cruel and wrong. Not misguided, not imperfect. Cruel and wrong. He described the prisoners as men buried alive, to be dug out in the slow round of years, and in the meantime dead to everything but torturing anxieties and horrible despair. He watched them shuffle through their cells, pale and hollow-eyed, flinching at human voices they had not heard in months or years. But his most famous passage targeted something the prison defenders could not dismiss: the invisible nature of the torture itself. "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain," Dickens wrote, "to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body, and because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye and sense of touch as scars upon the flesh, because its wounds are not upon the surface, and it extorts few cries that human ears can hear. Therefore I the more denounce it, as a secret punishment which slumbering humanity is not roused up to stay." Read that again. Immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. This was not a reformer hedging his criticism. This was not a politician seeking compromise. This was Charles Dickens, the most influential voice in the English language, calling Eastern State Penitentiary worse than physical torture, and he backed it up with specifics. He described a German prisoner, a man sentenced to 5 years for larceny. A more dejected, heartbroken, wretched creature it would be difficult to imagine, Dickens wrote. When the conversation turned to the man's wife, he shook his head at the word, turned aside, and covered his face with his hands. 5 years in a stone box for stealing, and the mention of his wife reduced him to silent weeping. Dickens met a sailor who had spent 11 years in isolation. 11 years. The man told Dickens that he does not look forward to going out, that he is not glad the time is drawing near, that he did look forward to it once, but that was very long ago, that he has lost all care for everything. Lost all care for everything. After 11 years alone, this man had been so thoroughly broken that freedom itself meant nothing to him. The outside world had become an abstraction. His cell was all he knew. Dickens called him a helpless, crushed, and broken man. Perhaps most damning was what Dickens learned about the release process. He asked prison officials what happened when prisoners finally walked out the gate. The answer chilled him. One official explained that it was not so much a trembling, though they did quiver. It was more of a complete derangement of the nervous system. They could not sign their names in the book, and sometimes could not even hold the pen. When they got outside the gate, they stopped and looked first one way and then the other, not knowing which way to take. Sometimes they staggered as if they were drunk. These were not criminals being punished. These were human beings being destroyed, methodically, systematically, in a building specifically designed for that purpose. The defenders of Eastern State pushed back hard against Dickens. They accused him of sensationalism. They pointed to their own reports showing calm, industrious prisoners contentedly working in their cells. They argued that Dickens had spent only a few hours in the prison and could not possibly understand the system's long-term benefits. But Dickens was not alone in his assessment. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political philosopher famous for democracy in America, visited Eastern State in 1831. He spent a week there, interviewing every single prisoner. He called the Pennsylvania system the most complete despotism he had ever witnessed, even though he later became a qualified supporter of isolation, arguing it reduced prison populations. He never denied its psychological toll. The British implementation provided even harder evidence. Pentonville Prison opened in London in 1842, modeled directly on Eastern State's design. Within 2 years, the results were catastrophic. Of 240 inmates, 15% exhibited symptoms of insanity, hallucinations, delusions, complete breaks with reality. At least 7 prisoners were transferred to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the infamous asylum known as Bedlam. Multiple suicide attempts occurred. A British government committee investigated in 1845 and concluded that prolonged isolation was psychologically unsustainable. They recommended capping solitary confinement from 9 to 15 months maximum, but at Eastern State, the separate system continued unchanged. When prisoners went mad, the physicians found explanations that protected the institution. They blamed African American prisoners, claiming black inmates had a unique nature that predisposed them to mental illness. They blamed overstimulation in the form of masturbation. They blamed weak constitutions. They blamed everything except the 18-inch stone walls and the silence that pressed in from every direction. The documentation piled up. An 1843 report to the Philadelphia College of Physicians noted that African American prisoners had twice the relative mortality rate of white prisoners under the separate system. The physicians did not ask whether isolation was killing them. They asked what was wrong with them that made them die. Charles Dickens published his account in October 1842. It became one of the most widely read critiques of any American institution in the 19th century. Reformers on both sides of the Atlantic cited it for decades, and Eastern State Penitentiary kept the separate system running for another 71 years because the men who built it could not admit they were wrong, and because the torture they had invented did not leave visible scars. But the isolation was not the only cruelty happening inside those walls. While the reformers boasted about eliminating corporal punishment, the guards had developed their own methods that left prisoners bleeding, frozen, and sometimes dead. The Pennsylvania system had one rule that its defenders repeated endlessly: No corporal punishment. This was supposed to be the great achievement, the moral high ground. Other prisons whipped their inmates. Other prisons used chains and stocks and branding irons. Eastern State had evolved beyond all that. Their punishment was isolation itself. Silent, clean, invisible. That was the official policy. The reality inside those Gothic walls was something else entirely. The first documented torture device was called the iron gag. Picture this. An iron collar, roughly horseshoe-shaped, gets forced into the prisoner's mouth and clamped onto his tongue. Chains connect the collar to a ring at the back, then run down to the prisoner's wrists, which are bound high behind his back. Here's how it works. If the prisoner relaxes his arms, the chains pull tight and the collar tears at his tongue. If he tries to relieve the pressure on his tongue, he has to wrench his arms higher behind his back. There is no comfortable position. There is no rest. Every movement causes pain, and the pain causes movement, and the cycle continues until the guards decide it's over. The iron gag caused profuse bleeding. Prisoners choked on their own blood, and at least one man died from it. His name was Matthias Macumzi, 44 years old, serving 12 years for manslaughter. In June 1833, Macumzi committed a violation that the separate system considered unforgivable. He spoke to another prisoner. For this crime, the guards applied the iron gag. 1 hour later, Matthias Macumzi was dead. His body was found in his cell, bruised and bloodied. The official cause of death was listed as apoplexy, which we would now call a stroke. But apoplexy does not explain the blood. It does not explain the bruises. It does not explain why Warden Samuel Wood ordered the body removed at night, quietly, with no coroner's inquest. The guards were told to keep their own secrets. Macumzi was not the only one. The iron gag was used regularly throughout the 1830s, always unofficially, always deniable. Prisoners learned to fear it more than the isolation itself. At least in your cell, alone, you were not actively bleeding. Then there was the water bath. In winter, guards would strip a prisoner naked and douse him with buckets of ice-cold water, then chain him to an exterior wall outside, exposed to the freezing Philadelphia night. They would leave him there for hours, sometimes until ice formed on his skin. Survivors described the sensation as feeling your body die from the outside in. First, your extremities go numb, then your core temperature starts dropping. You shake so violently you cannot control your own limbs, and the whole time you are chained to a wall, unable to move, unable to escape, unable to do anything except endure. Some prisoners emerged from the water bath with permanent damage. Frostbite that required amputation, nerve damage that never healed, and a few simply did not emerge at all. The mad chair was exactly what it sounds like. A restraint device with leather straps designed to immobilize the prisoner completely. Arms strapped down, legs strapped down, head strapped in place. The straps were tightened until circulation stopped. Prisoners were left in the mad chair for hours, sometimes days. The lack of blood flow caused permanent injury. Limbs had to be amputated, and the psychological effect was devastating. Unable to move, unable to see, unable to do anything except exist in frozen agony, prisoners emerged from the mad chair fundamentally changed. Some never recovered their sanity. But perhaps the worst punishment was the one they called the hole, or the Klondike. Beneath cell block 14, workers had excavated a series of underground chambers, 4 cells, carved into the earth, with ceilings only 6 feet high, no windows, no light, no plumbing, no ventilation, just dirt and darkness and whatever crawled in from the foundations. Prisoners sent to the hole received bread and water, nothing else. They sat in absolute blackness, unable to see their own hands, listening to rats moving in the darkness around them. Some stayed for days. Some stayed for weeks. Some stayed for months. The hole was where the separate system's promise of humane punishment collapsed entirely. This was not isolation designed for reflection. This was not silence meant to produce redemption. This was torture, pure and simple, inflicted on men who had already been broken by years of solitary confinement. In 1834, the Pennsylvania legislature launched an investigation. The evidence was overwhelming. There were deaths from the iron gag. Extended straitjacket use caused permanent injury. Prisoners were stripped and doused with water in freezing temperatures. The investigators used the phrase licentious and immoral practices, which meant corruption, bribery, and abuse at every level. The report documented everything: names, dates, methods. The testimony was damning, and nothing changed. Warden Samuel Wood kept his position. The torture devices remained available. The hole stayed open. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania looked at the evidence and decided that Eastern State Penitentiary was too important, too expensive, too symbolically valuable to reform. The building had cost $800,000. It had attracted international acclaim. Delegations from Europe continued to arrive to copy its design. How could Pennsylvania admit that their great experiment was producing not reformed citizens but broken minds and bleeding tongues? They could not, so they did not. The cruelty continued, just more carefully hidden. Officially, Eastern State prohibited corporal punishment. Unofficially, the guards knew exactly what they could get away with. And layered on top of the torture was another injustice that ran through the institution from its very first day: racial discrimination. Remember Charles Williams, prisoner number 1? The 18-year-old black farmer convicted of stealing a $20 watch? His selection was not random. Between 1833 and 1850, nearly 300 children and teenagers between the ages of 11 and 20 were imprisoned at Eastern State. Black children were grotesquely overrepresented. Why? Because Philadelphia's House of Refuge, the reform school designed to keep children out of adult prisons, only accepted white kids. Until 1849, if you were a black child who committed a crime in Philadelphia, you went to Eastern State Penitentiary, not to reform school, not to juvenile detention, to adult prison, to solitary confinement, to the same cells where grown men were losing their minds. Mary Ash was 11 years old when she was imprisoned at Eastern State for arson. A black girl sentenced to the same isolation that was destroying adult men. She contracted tuberculosis inside those damp stone walls. She died at 13, still incarcerated. 11 years old, sent to solitary confinement, dead at 13. The prison physicians kept separate tallies for black patients and white patients. When they noticed that African Americans had twice the mortality rate under the separate system, they did not question the system. They concluded that black prisoners had a unique nature that made them vulnerable. The building designed to reform criminals was killing them instead. It was killing black prisoners at twice the rate of white ones. But the gates stayed open. The cells stayed full. The silent torture continued for decades, until some famous faces started arriving, and the mythology of Eastern State took a different turn. By the early 20th century, the separate system was dead in everything but name. Eastern State Penitentiary had abandoned total isolation decades earlier, overwhelmed by overcrowding that made the original philosophy impossible. Cells designed for one man held 2 or 3. Prisoners worked together in shops and ate together in dining halls. The grand experiment had quietly failed, but Eastern State kept operating. Some of the most notorious criminals in American history passed through its Gothic gates. On August 8, 1929, a black limousine pulled up outside a Philadelphia movie theater. Inside was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in America. Chicago police had been trying to nail him for years. Murder, bootlegging, racketeering. They could not make anything stick. That night in Philadelphia, two detectives approached Capone as he left the theater. They found a .38 caliber revolver in his pocket. He was carrying a concealed weapon. A minor charge, but enough. Capone was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 1 year in Eastern State Penitentiary. Some historians believe he arranged his own arrest, that he wanted to get out of Chicago for a while. Rival gangsters had been following him through Philadelphia that very evening. A year in prison might have seemed safer than another year dodging bullets. Whatever the reason, Al Capone arrived at Eastern State on August 8, 1929, and became its most famous resident. The Philadelphia Public Ledger ran a sensational story on August 20, 1929, describing Capone's cell in breathless detail. Tasteful paintings on the walls, a polished desk with a desk lamp, an oriental rug on the floor, a powerful cabinet radio receiver of handsome design, playing waltzes. The article painted a picture of luxury behind bars, the gangster king living like royalty even in prison. The story became legend. For decades, visitors to Eastern State have heard about Al Capone's lavish cell, furnished like a fine hotel suite. The reality was more modest. The very next day, the Philadelphia Record published a correction of sorts. Capone did have a cell in a relatively comfortable block. He shared it with a roommate named Bill Coleman, an embezzler. They slept on standard prison cots and split a single dresser between them. Capone had a small rag rug made in the prison workshop, a vase of flowers that someone had sent him, a smoking stand shaped like a butler that he had acquired somewhere, a cheap radio. The Record noted dryly that Capone's cell was by no means the most luxuriously furnished cell in the prison. There are others that are more sumptuous. Warden Herbert Smith, nicknamed Hard-Boiled for his strict reputation, publicly insisted that Capone received no special treatment. "Nobody has shown any favoritism here, millionaire or pauper," Smith told reporters. Capone worked hard and observed every rule and earned his 2 months off for good behavior. Capone was released on March 17, 1930, after serving about 8 months. But the warden had one last trick. About 2,000 people had gathered outside the main gate, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous gangster walking free. Smith had secretly transferred Capone to Graterford Prison days earlier. When the crowd realized Capone was already gone, Smith reportedly grinned and said, "We certainly stuck one on your eye." Capone later told fellow prisoners that during his time at Eastern State, he was haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the 7 men murdered in the St. Valentine's Day massacre just months before his arrest. Whether he actually believed this or was simply playing up his reputation, nobody knows. But it added to the mythology. Then there was Willie Sutton. They called him the Actor, the Gentleman Bandit, the Babe Ruth of bank robbers. Sutton was famous for his disguises and his charm, for robbing banks with theatrical flair and without violence when he could avoid it. When someone asked him why he robbed banks, he supposedly replied, "Because that's where the money is." Sutton arrived at Eastern State in 1934, sentenced to 25 to 50 years for machine gun robbery. He would spend 11 years inside those walls, and he would try to escape at least 5 times. The most audacious attempt came on April 3, 1945. For nearly a year, Sutton and 11 other inmates had been digging. The mastermind was Clarence Kleinedienst, a plasterer who had earned the administration's trust. He received permission to replaster his own cell. And behind a false wooden panel concealed by a metal wastebasket, the prisoners built a tunnel. They dug with spoons and flattened tin cans, 15 feet down, then 97 feet horizontally, following the brick sewer system beneath the prison, then 15 feet back up toward Fairmount Avenue. They shored the tunnel with wooden scaffolding, ran electrical lights through it, even installed ventilation. The dirt was smuggled out in pockets and scattered across the exercise yard, one handful at a time. On the morning of April 3rd, the 12 men crawled through the tunnel during breakfast and broke through the ground in broad daylight on Fairmount Avenue. A passing police patrol spotted them almost immediately. Sutton was captured within minutes, 3 blocks from the prison. All 12 escapees were recaptured within 2 months. One inmate, James Grace, actually returned voluntarily on April 11th. He rang the doorbell and asked to be let back in. He was hungry. Over Eastern State's 142-year history, more than 100 escape attempts were made. At least 59 prisoners made it over or under the 30-foot walls. Nearly all were recaptured, except for a handful who vanished forever. Leo Callahan escaped on July 14, 1923. He and 5 accomplices built a 30-foot wooden ladder, smuggled in a revolver, took a guard hostage, and scaled the east wall in broad daylight. The other 5 were eventually caught. One made it as far as Honolulu before they found him. But Leo Callahan was never seen again. He remains technically at large. He would be over 130 years old today. The separate system had promised to transform criminals into citizens. Instead, it produced men so desperate to escape that they would spend years digging through dirt with spoons. And by the mid-20th century, Eastern State was not transforming anyone. It was just warehousing them, until it could not even do that anymore. By the middle of the 20th century, Eastern State Penitentiary was a prison in name only. The grand experiment had been abandoned for decades. The philosophy of redemption through isolation had given way to simple warehousing. Pack them in, keep them quiet, wait for their sentences to end. The building that was designed to hold 250 prisoners in perfect solitary isolation now crammed in over 1,700. Cells built for one man held 2 or 3. The private exercise yards had been converted into additional cell blocks. The vaulted corridors that once echoed with cathedral silence now roared with the noise of congregate living, and the men inside were angry. The first major riots erupted in 1933 and 1934. Overcrowding, rotten food, no recreation. Wages for prison labor so low they were insulting. Endless idleness for men with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The frustration boiled over. Prisoners set fires in their cells. They destroyed workshops. They smashed whatever they could reach. The state police were called in to restore order. The administration promised reforms. Some minor improvements were made. The underlying problems remained untouched. For the next 3 decades, Eastern State limped along. The building deteriorated. The plumbing failed. The heating system broke down every winter. Paint peeled from the vaulted ceilings. Rust ate through the iron doors. The Gothic fortress that had once represented the cutting edge of institutional design was rotting from the inside out. Then came January 10th, 1961. It started in cell block 9. A group of prisoners overpowered a guard, seized his keys, and stormed the central control room. Within minutes, they had released more than 800 inmates from their cells. The corridors filled with men who had nothing left to lose. 4 employees were taken hostage. 14 prisoners made a run for the garage, hoping to steal vehicles and crash through the gates. Fires broke out in multiple locations. The chaos spread through the cell blocks like a wave. The state police surrounded the prison. Tear gas canisters arced over the walls and exploded in the courtyards. For hours, nobody knew how it would end. 800 angry men, 4 hostages, a crumbling building, and a skeleton crew of guards who had lost control completely. Remarkably, nobody died. The hostages were released unharmed. The prisoners were forced back to their cells by the tear gas and the overwhelming police presence. By morning, it was over. But the 1961 riot was the beginning of the end. The state legislature looked at Eastern State and saw a facility that could not be saved. The building was too old, too decrepit, too expensive to maintain. Modern penology had moved on. The separate system was a historical curiosity. The Gothic architecture was a liability. not an asset. In January 1970, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania announced that Eastern State Penitentiary would close. The remaining inmates were transferred to a new facility at Graterford, 31 miles northwest of Philadelphia. A more modern design, better security, room to expand. The transfer took months. Cell by cell, block by block, the population drained away. Guards who had worked there for decades packed up their lockers and walked out for the last time. In 1971, Eastern State briefly reopened to hold overflow prisoners after a riot at Holmesburg Prison. A few hundred men cycled through for several months. Then they were gone too. And then silence. After 142 years of continuous operation, the gates of Eastern State Penitentiary closed for good. Approximately 75,000 to 85,000 prisoners had passed through those Gothic walls since Charles Williams arrived as prisoner number 1 in 1829. Over 50 documented suicides. Countless mental breakdowns. Untold suffering in the name of reform. The building that was supposed to transform America's approach to criminal justice sat empty. No guards, no prisoners, no purpose. Just 11 acres of crumbling stone and rusting iron, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather and time. For nearly 2 decades after closure, Eastern State Penitentiary sat abandoned. The city of Philadelphia had purchased the property for $400,000, but nobody knew what to do with it. Nature did not wait for a decision. It moved in. Trees sprouted through cracks in the cell block floors. Vines crawled up the stone walls and pushed through broken windows. An entire forest grew inside the prison, branches reaching toward those vaulted ceilings that were supposed to inspire divine reflection. Stray cats colonized the ruins, hunting rats in corridors where guards once walked in felt-covered shoes. The eye of God skylights, those circular openings meant to channel heavenly light into each cell, now channeled rain and snow. Water pooled on stone floors. Ice expanded in cracks and split the masonry apart. Rust consumed the iron doors. Paint peeled from every surface. The Gothic fortress was dissolving into the earth. Proposals came and went through the 1970s and the 1980s. Demolish it and build a criminal justice center. Convert it into 238 luxury apartments. Turn it into a shopping mall with restaurants and boutiques. Each plan died from lack of funding, lack of interest, or lack of imagination. By the mid-1980s, Eastern State was on the verge of disappearing entirely. One more abandoned building in a city full of them. One more relic of a forgotten era, waiting for the wrecking ball. Then a group of architects, preservationists, and historians formed the Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force. They saw something worth saving. Not because the building was beautiful, though in its ruined way it was. Not because the history was pleasant, because it absolutely was not. But because the building told a story that America needed to hear. In 1988, the task force successfully petitioned Mayor Wilson Goode to halt all redevelopment plans. Eastern State would be preserved, not restored. Preserved. There is a difference. The preservation philosophy they adopted is called stabilized decay. The goal is not to make the building look new again. It is to stop the deterioration without erasing the evidence of time. The rust stays. The peeling paint stays. The trees growing through the floors, most of them, stay. Visitors do not see a museum recreation of what Eastern State looked like in 1829. They see what 142 years of operation and decades of abandonment actually did to the place. It is honest in a way that full restoration never could be. Eastern State had actually been designated a National Historic Landmark back in 1965, while it was still functioning as a prison. That designation helped protect it from demolition, but did not guarantee its future. The task force's intervention did. In 1994, the site opened to the public for what they called hard hat tours. Visitors wore protective helmets as guides led them through crumbling cell blocks, warning them about falling debris and unstable floors. 10,000 people came that first year, far more than anyone expected. Today, Eastern State Penitentiary welcomes between 250,000 and 300,000 visitors annually. They walk the same corridors Charles Dickens walked in 1842. They peer into cells where men spent years in total isolation. They see Al Capone's cell, modestly furnished to match historical records rather than legend. They descend into the hole, those underground punishment cells beneath cell block 14. They stand in the central rotunda and look down all 7 radiating cell blocks, seeing exactly what the guards saw, understanding how the architecture itself was designed for control. An audio tour, narrated by Steve Buscemi, guides visitors through the history. Former prisoners, guards, and wardens speak in recorded interviews. The voices of the institution echo through headphones as you walk past rusting doors and crumbling walls. Every Halloween, Eastern State transforms into terror behind the walls, one of the largest and most elaborate haunted house attractions in America. Forbes has named it the #1 haunted house in the country. Over 100,000 visitors pass through during the 7-week Halloween season, and the revenue funds most of the year-round preservation and education programs. There is irony in that. A building designed to terrify criminals into redemption now terrifies tourists for entertainment. The Gothic architecture that was meant to make prisoners feel dread now makes visitors feel thrills. The screams echoing through cell blocks are staged, theatrical, fun. But the daytime tours are not about fun. They are about reckoning. Because Eastern State's legacy did not end when the gates closed in 1971. The ideas born inside those walls are still shaping American prisons today. A DX Florence, the federal supermax facility in Colorado, opened in 1994. It holds the most dangerous inmates in the federal system, in conditions remarkably similar to what John Haviland designed 165 years earlier. Prisoners spend 22 to 24 hours per day in cells measuring 7 by 12 feet. These conditions are almost identical to Eastern State's specifications. The isolation is nearly total, and the psychological effects are well documented. The debate about whether this constitutes torture sounds exactly like the debates that raged after Dickens published his account in 1842. More than 30 supermax facilities now operate across the United States. An estimated 55,000 to 80,000 people spend time in solitary confinement in American prisons every day. Research consistently shows that isolation increases the risk of suicide, self-harm, and mental illness. People who experience solitary confinement, even briefly, are more likely to die by suicide, homicide, or overdose after release. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has stated that solitary confinement exceeding 15 consecutive days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The United Nations called American prison practices torture. Scholars explicitly reference Eastern State Penitentiary when analyzing these modern conditions. The organization's Solitary Watch has asked directly, what has changed since Eastern State Penitentiary opened up in 1829? The answer, uncomfortably, is not enough. Walk through Eastern State Penitentiary today and you will notice something strange. The building is preserved in its decay, but it is not silent anymore. Tourists shuffle through the corridors, audio tours murmur from headphones. School groups cluster around exhibits. The place that was designed for total isolation now hosts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Find a moment between tour groups and stand alone in one of those vaulted cell blocks. Look up at the arched ceiling, the crumbling plaster, the eye of God skylight now open to the sky. Listen. The silence is still there underneath everything, waiting. This building stood for 142 years. Approximately 80,000 human beings passed through these gates. Some stayed for months. Some stayed for decades. Some never left at all, buried in unmarked graves or carried out in wooden boxes after the isolation broke something inside them that could not be fixed. The reformers who built this place genuinely believed they were doing good. Benjamin Rush thought criminals could be redeemed through reflection. The Quakers believed that silence would allow prisoners to hear the voice of God. John Haviland designed every detail to maximize isolation while preserving human life. They were idealists, not monsters. And they were catastrophically wrong. The separate system did not reform criminals. It destroyed them. Men who entered Eastern State as petty thieves emerged as broken husks, unable to sign their own names, staggering like drunks when they tried to walk through the gates to freedom. The system that promised redemption delivered psychological torture on an industrial scale. Charles Dickens saw it in 1842. He called it worse than any physical torture. He wrote that the wounds were invisible, that the screams could not be heard, that humanity slumbered while men were slowly driven mad behind those beautiful Gothic walls. And we kept doing it anyway. We knew it was failing, and we did not stop. We exported the design to 300 prisons worldwide. We refined the techniques. We built supermax facilities in the 1990s using the same basic model. We are still doing it today, right now. The crumbling walls of Eastern State Penitentiary have stood for nearly 200 years, first as a monument to reform, then as a working prison, then as an abandoned ruin, and now as a warning. The museum that operates here today does not shy away from the implications. An exhibit called Prisons Today, Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration, connects the history directly to current debates about solitary confinement, racial disparities, and the purpose of punishment. Outside, a massive sculpture called The Big Graph displays United States incarceration rates, forcing visitors to confront numbers that dwarf any other developed nation. Eastern State Penitentiary asks a question that America still has not answered. If we have known for nearly 200 years that prolonged isolation destroys the human mind, why do we keep doing it? The silent cell block does not offer an answer. It just holds the evidence. The vaulted ceilings, the iron doors, the eye of God skylights, open now to rain and snow. The cells where men lost their minds, preserved exactly as they collapsed. Walk through this place and you are walking through a warning about good intentions, a warning about institutional cruelty, a warning about what happens when we design systems to control human beings and then refuse to admit when those systems fail. The machines are gone. The guards are gone. The prisoners are gone. The dream of redemption through isolation died somewhere in these corridors, probably within the first decade. Probably in a cell where a man sat alone for so long that he forgot his own name. All that is left is stone and silence, and the weight of what happened here. Welcome inside the silent cell block, where America's prison system was born, tested, and proven to fail. It is also where the experiment continues, in different buildings, under different names, to this very day.